So factory overhead, okay? So for factory overhead costs, we um we usually allocate factory overhead. So this is different from direct labor and direct materials because factory overhead is not directly related to the jobs. So that is factory overhead cost cannot be identified with or traced to specific jobs, and for this reason, factory overhead costs are allocated to jobs. The process by which factory overhead or other costs are assigned to a cost object as a job is called cost allocation. Okay, so that's the right term for that, cost allocation. So the factory overhead costs are allocated to jobs using a common method related to each job. This method would be then called as activity base. So allocation base or activity driver. So the activity base used to allocate overhead should reflect the consumption or use of factory overhead cost. There are three common activity bases to allocate factory overhead costs, and those are: first is the direct labor hours, second one is the direct labor cost, and lastly the machine hours. Okay. So, factory overhead costs are normally allocated or applied to jobs using a predetermined overhead rate. So, we get the predetermined overhead rate by dividing the estimated total factory overhead cost to the estimated activity base. So if, for example, the total factory cost is 50,000 for the year, so I'll just write in this one. So assuming that the total factory overhead cost for estimated factory overhead cost is 50,000 for the entire year, okay, and activity base is 10,000 direct labor, so that's 50,000 of our direct labor, so the answer for that one is 5 pesos per direct labor hour. So if one job has a actual direct labor of 350 hours multiplied by 5, then the total factory overhead would be 1,750. And if the second one has direct labor hours of 500 hours multiplied by 5, that's 2,500. So how do you record this one? So let's just place it job 1, job 2. So the total of 4,250. So you record that one now as work in process 4,250 and factory overhead credit of 4,250. So to summarize, the factory overhead account is increased. So FO. So when it's debited, it's increased. When it's credited, it's decreased. Okay, so this is for the actual overhead cost. So this is actual overhead cost, and applied overhead is usually credited. Okay. The actual and applied overhead usually differ because the actual overhead costs are normally different from the estimated overhead cost. Depending on whether actual overhead is greater or less than applied overhead, the factory overhead account will have a debit or credit ending balance. So if the applied, they call this one, if the applied overhead is less than the actual overhead, the debit is called under applied factory overhead. And if the applied overhead is more than the actual overhead, then the factory overhead account will have a credit balance. Okay, so let's take for example, call this. So for example, so this is the account using the same. Okay, so let's just say that for the fact, okay, let's use another color. For this one, since this is the applied, so that's credit, that's 4,250. Let's just say that the credit, the actual cost incurred is 4,600. So the over applied balance would be how much? That's 350. Okay, so let's take into example. Okay, let's erase this one. Okay, sorry, let's erase this one. Timer's running out. So for example, company A has a total overhead cost of 100,000 per year, estimated 100,000 a year. Direct labor hours are estimated 25,000, so we'll determine the predetermined rates. So that's 4 pesos per direct labor. So if job 101 in March, job using the data, so let's just say from the previous example that we had, that's 800 hours and 600 hours, so multiplied by 4, so that's going to be 3,200 and 2,400, so the total cost for this one is 5,600. So the work in process would be 5,600 and the factory overhead is also 5,600. So in this case, the previous example that we have, so the factory overhead that previous is 8,300, so there's under application for the factory overhead. Okay, so yes, that's it.